meteorologist when a tornado is approaching. Don't be scared, but be prepared. At its core, the VMC sells lots and lots of records, but one of the VMC's dirty little secrets is that they also do repairs, and it's really been repairs over certain stretches that have kept the place open. That's a view of the repair area. So if they've been surviving on repairs, what actually sells at a 78 RPM record store at this point in time? Near the front register, there is what is called the Better Box. These are records that a lot of collectors would recognize as valuable or desirable. On occasion, when blues records, pre-war blues records, or doo-wop or stuff like that shows up, it usually ends up in the Better Box. Now, some days you may find absolutely nothing in the Better Box. Some days you may find a couple of Washington Phillips records. You won't, because I bought them, but you could have if you had been there before I was. Unfortunately, having large numbers of records like that, not the type of thing that happens very often, because he relies on what walks in the door. So, in fact, what sells at 78 RPM record stores here in the, I think we're in the 21st century, is actually a reflection of what sold in 78 RPM record stores in the 20th century. In other words, the least desirable discs to someone who is an advanced collector, what collectors deride as pop music, that's what sells. Popular music is the most frequently purchased music at the VMC. Holtus points out that blues sells very quickly when it comes in, but it doesn't happen very often. And many people who go into the VMC are simply looking for something that they heard on Spotify, which is generally just popular music. Finding copies or keeping copies of records like this, Rum and Coca-Cola, In the Mood, Take the A Train, and Paper Doll, that is what he has difficulty keeping in stock. Other catchy hits from the 40s or 50s, they fly out the door because it is, in fact, a record store. As seemingly small as the market for stuff like this is, it's what sells at a modern 78 record store. Now, it would be very easy to disparage people who are amazed that they can walk into a record store in 2024 and find an original copy of a record from the 1940s, 1950s, take it home, have it in their hot little hands, and go home with it. But that's just something that really hasn't crossed the mind of a lot of people who aren't familiar with this place. Now, beyond the classic records we showed earlier, and by classic I mean the popular ones, the sales of 78 RPM records to crowds like us makes sense. But what's happening right now is sales are beginning to progress to some very different and what I would consider pretty unusual sources. The resale bounce, don't hate me for talking about this, the resale bounce of Harry James' It's a Long, Long Time has been the source of mockery from probably people in this room. It's also been a source of money for people in this room. And it's been a source of money for places like the Vintage Music Company. Records that used to sell for $5, or more appropriately, did not sell for $5, are now $50 and up. And stuff like that, when it happens, really helps places like the Vintage Music Company. And by places like the Vintage Music Company, I mean the Vintage Music Company. Now, while we, I might be including myself in there, may scoff at the reasoning behind why a record like It's a Long, Long Time suddenly becomes popular and is suddenly flying off shelves, it's opened a small window into a new place to sell and to share 78 RPM records with young people. And unexpected inroads for records like this are starting to creep into places you have no idea exist. A teenager recently walked into the VMC and requested a Freddie Nagel and his orchestra record. Okay, that's a little odd to be sure, but a week later, another teenager walked in, said, "Do you have a song by Freddie Nagel?" Well, at that point, you have to start paying attention. And as it turns out, this record, Sophisticated Swing by Freddie Nagel and his orchestra, somehow crept onto the soundtrack of a video game. And now you have teenagers and kids in their teens and 20s looking for original copies on original formats. And stuff like that is what modifies the sales platform that is a place like Vintage Music. So you may be asking, so what other records? Have there been other records that have appeared in video games? Recently, yes, and a lot. Now, you may not have noticed a big sales uptick in any of these, but the Vintage Music Company has. And you look at these and you're like, wow, I've got a lot of those. Some of these records, because of things like video games, kids are now looking for records like this. And let's be fair, every kid on the planet should know Old Man Mose by Eddie Duchin and his orchestra with Patricia Norman on vocal. If you don't, you need it. This was from an interview. This was from an interview years ago by Minnesota Public Radio, and he was simply saying there are some records that had been there the entire duration of the store. At that point, it was, I think, 24 years, that had never, ever sold. And some of those records, maybe all it needs is for something like Too Fat Polka to show up in a Marvel movie. Too Fat Polka is the bane of the VMC because there have been literally hundreds of copies of this record go through there, and it simply does not sell. Other things that do not sell. Frankie Carl. Frankie Carl, now I will preface this. He says that Frankie Carl records have sold. But he also said every single Frankie Carl record he ever sold was to Frankie Carl. And to me, that's just absolutely charming. I find that fascinating and wonderful, but Frankie Carl is not the only one. This is a picture of B. Wayne. And B. Wayne was a regular at VMC until her death in 2017. She was always looking for recordings from early in her career when she was what we call the canary for Larry Clinton's orchestra. And a frequent appearance. She frequently appeared on your hit Parade. Some of you may recognize this gentleman. Tiny Tim walked into the store on occasion in what Scott described as the exact same jacket he was wearing when he was on Laugh-In. And then this lady, Betty Garrett, an amazing Broadway performer and probably best known for being the extremely liberal next-door neighbor of Archie Bunker. Others, Peter Shickley, Dr. Demento was from Minneapolis, and so things like that. But in addition to the famous people who walked in, some people figured out VMC makes a pretty good story. So National Public Radio, Minnesota Public Radio, newspapers, magazines, all of them were, well, some of them, were interested in making a story about the VMC. And as crazy as it seems that a store that can sell you 78 RPM records and can service your Victor 8.9 exists at all, the fact that it does so without things like Twitter, without things like computer, it doesn't have a website that really amounts to anything, it's just kind of amazing to me and apparently amazing to a lot of other people. When I first arrived for ARSC, I went into the store, I guess this was on Tuesday, and the earliest record I found was from 1896. The newest record I found of the 78 genre was from 1974. It was a promotional issue from 74. That's an 88-year gap where people bought 78 RPM records. And if you had been in Minneapolis during that 88-year stretch, where would you have gone to get records? You would have gone to your local record store. So as much as radio and as much as magazines tend to romanticize places like this, we really need to look at what the VMC actually is. And the VMC is a local record store. Now, the community that the VMC occupies met with some pretty nasty situations a few years ago. George Floyd was murdered in 2020. That was an event that took place up the street from the VMC. If I can manage to get the magic laser pointer here. The purple dot here is the site of George Floyd's death. This map represents the damaged, destroyed, and burned buildings. This is the site of George Floyd's death. This, underneath this spot, is where the VMC is.
Wow.
And that damage indicator is not there because of the VMC. That damage indicator is there because the building across the street and the building across the intersection were destroyed. But the VMC was not. And I don't have a good reason why. I could wax poetic about it, but suffice it to say that there was a lot of damage in the area. For some reason, they chose not to destroy the VMC. I don't know if it was because they recognized it as a local business. There were no precautions taken. The entire front of that building is glass. He did not board up the building. There were people on the roof of the building taking pictures, and the pictures you saw up there briefly were taken from the top. But it was not protected in any particular way. It just wasn't destroyed. And the reason that's important, and the reason it should give you pause, is really this. Because while you can go into VMC and you can buy, or not buy, records that are in there, the amount of research and history in the Vintage Music Company is what truly would have been lost. And it's the reason I wanted to do a presentation on the VMC at Assoc. One of the annoyances for me, and presumably every single person who goes into the VMC, is the fact that there is practically no room in any of the aisles. Why is that? Because the proprietor does not sell recordings until he has taken the recordings, he has looked at it, and he has compared the information that he has in front of him with every existing piece of discography about that record he can find. Every single one of them. And that's why the aisles are packed with junk, because those are records he hasn't gotten to yet. Now, in the basement, hundreds of thousands of records, those have all been looked at. But you look at things like this, and some of those things that were on that screen just now were in fact treasures. But all of this discography work that he has done over the years, 30 plus years of meticulous record keeping, trying to discover lost tapes. That record wasn't released on this label. Yes, it was. Here's a copy. If you are a researcher, if you're interested in discography, if you are a music archivist, if you like musical books, there are tens of thousands of bits of discography information there that, quite frankly, practically no one knows about. There is a massive amount of history in that building. And the presentation that we saw earlier this morning in the plenary session, I believe it did a good job of pointing out the importance of places like this. Thousands of pages of handwritten documentation like that, containing information, much of which is not in discographies or is information that is different than the discographies. Now, I completely get it. Walking into this is not like walking into an archive.
Don't tell us.
Yeah, I will not. I will not. Trust me, he's heard from them. If you are going to go to the Vintage Music Company, a lot of the work is on you. If you are going to be a record collector and go in there, most record companies, most record shops would love to make it very easy on you to buy records. That is not this. But I'm telling you that there are treasures, and there is information, and there is data, and there is so much that I'm not going to debate whether it needs to be in a museum, whether it needs to be an archive, or whether it needs to be in collections, but it does need to be preserved. I'd like to encourage all of you to take a deep breath. If you have OCD, keep the nearest exit within sight, but stop by the VMC. If you do, it always helps to ask for specific things as opposed to anything else, but I really do believe that it is an important place. It is an important location in the world of music archiving. And I think we're going to continue to discover that over the next few years. Thanks for joining me at the Vintage Music Company. One purchase, which I wasn't going to mention, but you posted it on public, on social media.
There's no more Ray cylinders there.
Yeah. He doubled the University of California, Santa Barbara's collection of Ray cylinders at the VMC. And good luck finding those anywhere. And you found a few. There are things there. He'll tell you there aren't. That's the funny thing. Like, there's nothing here. Nothing's come in a long time. And there's still amazing things there. It's just trying to find them or getting them to sell them.
Other questions?
Yeah, if you do choose to attend, I don't know what to tell you to expect, because what one person gets is completely different than what other people get.
We stopped in on Wednesday, and I spent 2 hours looking through the Jeanette label and Champion, and got 10 records. And I was surprised that the Electro Beam label wasn't priced any differently than the other earlier Jeanette labels, and so I was able to get 10 records. I got 9 on Jeanette and 1 on Champion. And so I was deliriously happy. Never saw that many Jeanette labels, you know, in bins like that before.
Well, I'm not really. I don't want anybody to feel like, oh, he's doing a commercial. I have no idea what his pricing structure is. No idea whatsoever. I tried to ask him, and the explanations I got, I would say they're not repeatable, not because they weren't, not because they were vulgar. I'm just still not sure.
Well, I paid, if you must know.
Yeah, we do.
I paid between $2 and $12, and there was some for 15. But I mean, I looked at a lot of records, and some are rather, trash. So I got to make a lot of choices in 2 scary hours.
Scary hours. Yeah. I appreciate that. I appreciate it. Like I say, it's just so strange to me the way. I mean, it's the dichotomy of 2 people going in 30 minutes apart.